Ladies and gentlemen, I am Harry Lauseniziris, and this is my grecochess YouTube channel. The other day, I asked from my Facebook friends if they had any game that they would like me to present. And what I meant, but forgot to write, is I meant one of their own games, ideally a game that they want, they are proud of, and they would like the entire world to know about that. One of my Facebook friends asked me to present a game that's took place in 1914, meaning clearly it was not my friend's game. They believe none of the games of anybody watching this video. 1914 is 111 years ago. The opponents were Osip Bernstein for white and Jose Raul Capablanca for black. Capablanca doesn't need an introduction. He was the third world champion of chess, Capablanca from Cuba, from 1921 until 1927, succeeding Edward Lasker and being just before Alexander Alekhin. His opponent, Osip Bernstein, unfortunately, he needs some introduction. I had never heard the name before, and I'm going to share the information of chess.com about him. They call him one of the forgotten chess masters. And they highlight 3 games that he played against Michael Chigorin, against Akiba Rubinstein, and against Miguel Natzdorf. All 3 of them, Chigorin, Rubinstein, and Natzdorf, are very famous, although none of them became a world champion, but they were very near. In fact, Natzdorf is famous for the book that he wrote, My System, where he analyzes in detail various details of positional play. But the game I'm going to show to you is none of these 3. To satisfy the request of my Facebook friend, it is a group against, it's a game against Capablanca. And we're going now to show what happened in that game. As I mentioned before, Bernstein from France has white, Capablanca from Cuba has black. In today's in advance, the first 8 books were what is called book moves, meaning nothing original. They have been analyzed extensively in theory. And all they do is the 2 players try to control the center, develop their pieces, exert as much control as possible, and let's see what happened. The opening is what we call the Queen's Gambit decline. However, the opening is not important because you'll see that the result is decided much later than that. The opening just ensured that the 2 players were more or less at the same position. None of them had a big advantage. Just to tell you, as perhaps you may know, that on the right side, you'll see the computer evaluation. If it's a plus, means white stands better. If it is a minus, it means that black stands better. But until now, you see the differences are extremely small. The computer will tell you for every move. Until now, they say it's a book move. Later on, after move 8, they'll tell you if it was the best or not, and if not, which would have been the best move. And then they'll show which ones they believe is the best move for the other side, the best 3 moves, and the analysis of these moves. That is where the theory ends. Move number 8 for black, the pawn takes a d5, is a book move. The move number 9 for white is going to be one of their own. Queen goes to a4. Excellent, but not the best according to the computer. And black settles the bishop, sending it to b7. This bishop, well, currently is blocked by the pawn at d5, but if this pawn disappears one way or the other, then the black bishop controls a big diagonal, the big light-colored diagonal from a8 to h1. White, of course, doesn't want it and forces black to change bishops. After the exchange, black pushes the pawn to c5, trying to exert pressure on d4 and gain more space. What Bernstein will do now is exchange his bishop with the opponent's knight. Why? Because if this knight suddenly disappears because it finds even a pawn to grab, then this pawn is in danger. So to avoid such possibilities, Why not exchange it even though the computer thinks that's inaccuracy? The advantage of white becomes minimal, 0.07. And now Bernstein exchanges the pawns at c5. Good, but not the best. And you see now the advantage goes to black, although it's extremely small, 0.05. Castling for white. And black develops the queen to b6. If the queens are exchanged, then the rook at a8 controls the open a file. Well, of course, the pawn at a2 cannot be grabbed because of the knight at c3, but in fact, it's not going to be open. I'm sorry, it's going to be semi-open because there is only a white pawn. But you don't want to give your opponent any kind of advantage if you can prevent it. That's why queen, instead of taking black's queen, goes back to e2, and Capablanca pushes the pawn to c4 to get more space. And now the d file is semi-open, and that's why white is going to put his rook on d1. And black will retaliate by putting his rook on d8. And also the square d4, if you can see, is what's called an outpost, because it's outpost for white, that is, because there is no black pawn on either c or e file that can attack it. The c pawn has already gone to c4, while the e pawn has already disappeared. That is why knight goes to d4. And black places his bishop on b4. White tries to get some space and exert pressure on c4 by moving the pawn to b3. Black places his rook on c8. And now we change pawns. And like before, now it is white that takes towards the center and black takes away from the center. And we have the pawn on c4. It is isolated, meaning there are no pawns on b or d files to protect it. It's a passed pawn, meaning if suddenly all queens, rooks, bishops, knights would disappear, the pawn would very easily promote. Meaning if everything disappeared and the pawn was free to play, in 3 moves would arrive here, the king would not stop it. And if it was white to play, the king might stop it at the last moment, but this would give enough time for white to push his own pawns and have an advantage there. Move number 20. Rook goes to c2. White is trying to double his rooks on the semi-open c file. Black is going to take the knight. Rook takes back. And knight goes to d5. From now on, for the next few moves, you see that the black knight is attacking the white rooks. Of course, the rooks have plenty of squares to go. That's not a problem. The problem is that while you defend your own pieces from the opponent's attack, you cannot advance your own plans. Unless, of course, you hit what's called the danger level, meaning they attack your rook and you attack their queen or their king. This can happen, not very often, but sometimes it's a way to diffuse any kind of danger. The rook, of course, doesn't stay on c3, goes to c2. Now the pawn goes to c3. Now it is even near a promotion. Now you see that if everything disappears, even if it was white's turn to move, king goes to f1, pawn to c2, king to e1, and pawn promotes. And that is where we're now. We have isolated pawn at c3 that if white attacks it enough times, meaning more than once it's defended, white can grab it and win it and be a pawn ahead. But on the other side, if the major pieces disappear, the pawn is a passed pawn and very near promotion. And let's see what's going to happen. Finish move number 23. And move number 24, rook goes to, excuse me, the knight goes to b. I'm sorry. We are now at move number 23. And the rook goes from d1 to c1. See now that The pawn is attacked twice by whites and is defended twice by blacks. The black rook would go to c5. Now the knight goes to b3 to attack, now it's the other way around. The white knight tries to attack the black rook. Rook goes to c6, knight goes to d4, rook goes to c7. And the knight goes to b5, it's protected by the white queen, so the black queen cannot take it, and attacks once again the rook at c7. Of course, the rook is more valuable than a knight, and if white could take the black rook for the price of the white knight, white would win an exchange and be ahead. So the rook goes to c5. And now white is doing the math and is saying the following. The pawn at c3 is attacked 3 times by white, from the knight at b5 and the rook from c2 and c1. How is it defended? Once by the knight at, at the d5 and once by the rook at c5. This means that if you start exchanges, white wins the pawn. And that's what white is going to do. But you're going to see that the computer doesn't place anywhere among the top 3 moves for white, knight taking on c3. Of course, the players had no access to computer. They couldn't know what the computer would suggest. The computer would rather have the knight go to d4 like before, perhaps repeat the moves and get a draw, to a3 perhaps, or even push the pawn to a4. But when the knight on move 27 grabs the pawn at c3, computer says it's a blunder. And you may be wondering why. What is so wrong about this move? We're going to see later. Most of us will not be able to see it, but Capablanca, without a computer, he saw it. And that's what he did. Let's start exchanges. Knight takes knight, rook takes knight, rook takes rook, rook takes rook, and we are at move 29 for black. Computer says, of course, that black has an enormous advantage, but how many of us would have seen what is happening? Black plays the best move according to the computer. Queen goes to b2. And you may be wondering what is so great about this move. If you don't look at the evaluation, you say, hey, black gives away his queen for free. Yes, but look what's going to happen. But the computer says this is a great move, but look what would happen if the two queens stare at each other. If white queen takes black queen, then rook goes to d1, it's mate. If white queen goes to d3, queen goes to a1, queen to f1, and queen takes e3. That's what's happening. If white wants to avoid mate, they could do it by putting the queen on f1, and but then black, instead of exchanging the queens, will take the rook on c3. Of course, black has to be careful, because if black is not careful, then the rook at c3 can go to c8 and have backrank mate. What else can white do? Queen goes to f1, and then black queen takes the rook at c3. King goes to f1, same story. So no matter what white does, either they get checkmated backrank, or they lose at least a rook. And that's why at this part of the game, Osip Bernstein resigned. Ladies and gentlemen, as you saw, for 26 moves, both players played extremely well. And how many of us could have been able to match Capablanca for the first 26 moves? That's amazing. And the narrow, not so small, the computer sees a blunder, but an error that many of us would not have been able to foresee, that's what changed everything. If there is any lesson to learn other than to admire Capablanca, is that we always need to be very careful of back rank threats. And if there's a time that for us to play and there is nothing obvious to do and we have no idea what to do, if the king is covered by 3 pawns in the front, you might think, why not just push a pawn to give what's called luft air to the king? It might be very useful later, because later on you may not have this move when you need it. This ends the game, Bernstein versus Capablanca. Hope you enjoyed it. And once again, if any of you has any game you'd like me to show, whether it's your own game, a game that you won and you're so proud of, or maybe a game of someone else that you'd like to see presented, please tell me so. I'll be glad to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Hariros Eniziris, and this is grecochess. Hope to see you soon in another video. Goodbye.